Thank you very much. I'm Keri Brandt, and this other lady here is Janine. And we just wanted to start real quick just by thanking Quivira for inviting us here. It feels like a great honor. I know a lot of other people who have been speaking have been saying that, but it is truly an honor to be invited and a real privilege to be able to share our ideas with you. So we wanted to thank the Quivira staff and the board. We're very grateful. So I'm going to outline real quick about what we're going to talk about in terms of zombie agriculture. And so what we want to look at today is, of course, what is zombie agriculture? And in doing that, we're going to have to talk a little bit about what zombies are, because there might be some of you that don't really know what zombies are. And then we're going to look at how did we get here? How did we get to zombie agriculture? And in particular, we're going to look at the important role that debt has played in creating zombie agriculture. And then we want to explore what happens to consumers and producers in this context. And then finally, we want to close with thinking about sort of how do we accompany each other through this sort of life and these realities as we move forward. So it's me. Okay, so I'll start for a little bit. My interest in this topic really has been born out of a lifetime of living in relation to animals. I grew up at a wonderful place called Blue Cloud, and pretty much my whole life has been centered around horses. And when I went to graduate school, I then sort of made a career out of talking to people endlessly about humans and their relationships to animals. And so I was pretty steeped, or I still am pretty steeped sort of in the world that humans and animals create together. And then about a decade ago, I met my husband David. He's a fourth generation cattle rancher in the San Luis Valley. Both of his parents have deep roots in the valley, and their families came there in the late 1800s. And so coming to the ranch, I didn't eat meat when I came to the ranch, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But coming and living in relationship to all this sort of wonderful family, and there's so many wonderful people in the valley, a lot of them are here in Durango, it really began to challenge my right-wrong thinking about what it means to be human and what it means to eat. So I forgot to slide.
Okay, can you hear me? This is so strange. I actually came to the first Quivira conference. It was in a high school somewhere, maybe over in West Mesa, and it's grown a lot. It's a bigger deal than it was then, which gives me hope. I grew up in the shadow of the HD Mountains, on 400 acres of dry land, overgrazed sagebrush land with my twin sister. Here we are. In this house that my parents rescued from abandonment to cows and moved somewhat miraculously so that we could have a better view, being moved, of the La Plata Mountains. I have gathered the stories of the 5 bands of Utes who called a massive expanse of the Four Corner States home, and knew the stories associated with each place that was passed down through in an oral tradition as they wandered through. The stories of vast sheep farmers who left arboglyphs on aspen trees along the Pine Piedra stock trail. Of the cowboys who also left some rather lewd arboglyphs on the same Pine Piedra stock trail, and worked for the HD Cattle Company in 1886, and mistakenly overgrazed the land and went broke by 1892. Of the homesteaders like Samuel Park who tried to make it on this now degrading piece of land and went broke. I have stories associated with each nook and cranny as my parents undertook the massive job of beginning to restore this landscape, while my sister and I played chase on our horses, or I fumed at my father for making me weed corn when I was being eaten alive by no-see-ums. I have stories of leaving to go to college and graduate school here in Albuquerque and having children, and then moving back with my husband Keith and my children Hannah and Guthrie, who are now all grown up, and building a straw bale house down the road from my parents with friends and communities such that every stuccoed wall, here's our stucco party, has stories. As the White Mountain Apaches say, finding morality to the anthropologist Keith Basso, I am stalked by this landscape. The land holds meaning. I have teetered on the edge of death. Here's our truth window. If any of you have a straw bale house, you know that they all have truth windows. So you can see that it really is straw. I have teetered on the edge of death after contracting the septicemic plague of the Black Death fame while messing around in a pond that still held the plague bacteria, Yersinia pestis, several months after it had killed the whole colony of prairie dogs. So many people say to me, now you must hate prairie dogs. I can't even understand what they're saying. Every spring, one or two come back, and I want to tell them, go away, this is a death trap. Yersinia pestis is still living here, and get out while you can. But they don't, and they die. I know what death feels like from Yersinia pestis as they shake and shake and shake until finally their heart collapses from trying to keep the blood in their veins. How can I hate prairie dogs when I know what this kind of death feels like? So when I am confronted with right-wrong choices or opinions, it doesn't compute. I don't even know what it means to live in a right-wrong, good-evil dualistic world. This is not what I have learned from a storied landscape. But it doesn't mean I am without morals. No, it's just that these morals are much more complex than choices. So I try to remember what so many of my Navajo students at Fort Lewis College have taught me: walk in beauty. Walk in beauty before me, walk in beauty behind me. Oops. It's dropping. Oh, now I'm breathing in. I gotta sing Material Girl. Okay. So, zombies do not live in relationship. They do not live in beauty. They do not live in stories. They are zombies. They eat brains. Whether we are talking about the zombies of Haitian lore, whose corpses are reanimated by voodoo priests. These corpses are the unnatural dead killed by suicide and murder that hang around their graves unable to move on and therefore pressed into endless labor and the mambo's bidding. Or modern zombies, infected by a virus of unknown origin, mindlessly seeking brains to eat, making The Walking Dead the most watched television series ever.
Okay, so now that you know what zombies are, let's tell you a little bit about zombie agriculture. So, zombie agriculture, we all know that we are living in a time where in the U.S. we have high levels of denigrated, if not dead soil. And these are pictures that I took when I was driving in the San Luis Valley on a spring day on the way to meet a potato farmer, and you can see it was even hard to see the road signs. And on a spring day in the valley when the winds are really kicking, it's not unusual for the air to look like this in certain parts of the valley. And so this dead soil is sort of part of that idea of a zombie-like landscape. Another way in which we can think about zombies is that in zombie agriculture, industrial agriculture, our animals are housed in near-death conditions. If we just take a look at sort of this pig, I think she'd be on your right side in this gestational crate. This is pretty much where she's going to live out her life. She'll have her babies here. She has food provided to her in the front end of her body. She's on a metal grate, and and she's able to sort of excrete her excrements, and they are cleanly washed down. And this is to this idea that to protect her from killing and rolling over on her piglets. And so I think we could all maybe agree that when animals are living like this, they're sort of really living in this sort of zombie-like, almost living dead-like condition. So the folklore around zombies in sort of a modern idea is that they're infected by this virus, this unknown contagion that comes from we don't know where. And so we started to think about chemical drift in agriculture in terms of as analogous to this idea of a virus. And so this is a map of Dicamba drift. It's a Dicamba drift injury map. This study just came out 2 weeks ago from the University of Missouri. And what they were looking at is dicamba is an herbicide. It's been around for decades. But more recently, Monsanto created a soybean plant and a cotton plant that is resistant to dicamba. And so farmers that were using Monsanto seed began to also use dicamba on their crops. Of course, the dicamba drifted and then landed on other farmers' crops who weren't resistant to dicamba. And so they say that at this point they've totaled 3.6 million acres just this year alone that have been affected by this dicamba drift. And I just want to note, because I was thinking so much about Alan Williams' presentation yesterday morning, that he talked about the Mississippi River running right down to the Gulf of Mexico, and right in the middle of this sort of yellow area of this dicamba map, that's where the Mississippi River runs, so of course it drifts there too. And then for zombies, they're just like mindlessly hungry. They have to eat, and they're insatiable. Like they can never get enough to eat. And so we were thinking about sort of this emphasis on efficiency and high yield agriculture in industrial agriculture. And then I just found this picture of a tractor, and I was like, if there really was a zombie tractor, I think this might be it. And it's hard. I think it's harvesting grapes. So that idea, that metaphor of mindless hunger fits here. Okay, so then, poof, right? Like zombies, we reanimate that which has been dead, right? So in terms of plants, we have reanimation practices. We put fertilizer on the soils. We use herbicides, pesticides, water, and then all of a sudden, a crop begins to emerge. And so it looks like there's life there, and I guess there is a crop living there, but nothing else is there. So in a sense, it's sort of like putting makeup on a corpse. We sort of take this dead land and reanimate it as if it's alive. And I think in terms of animals, we do this in terms of symbolism. So we can go into the store and we see lots and lots of photos of happy pigs and happy chickens and happy cows, all living in sort of idyllic conditions and in harmony with animals. And so on the consumer side, then what this means is that the consumer, in a sense, is living in a total context of reanimation. So that they can go into the grocery store and they can buy their fruits and vegetables, and they're shiny and clean, and there's no bugs and no dirt, and if they're lucky, they'll see pictures of happy farmers and happy animals on the way. And so when we began to look at this, sort of what's missing from all this is sort of what we know is true about eating is that sort of that fundamental cycle of living and dying, and sort of all this reanimation sort of disappears that story.
So, zombie agriculture is not the effect of an unknown virus or a voodoo priest, but it is the history of loss directly related to three major factors in the 20th century. High input fossil fuel ag, the Depression and the Dust Bowl, and a narrative that emerged after World War II of Feed the World. A legacy that turned ranchers and farmers away from their storied landscapes and the debt they owed to the soil, the water, and the communities of animals, plants, and people to make enough money to pay their debts. The history of us living in this country is a tale of tremendous loss. We don't like to think about the loss that is part of our history, and we like to blame each other for everything that is going wrong. I think we see this right now in the political system. Let's just duke it out. And we like to ignore the fact that we are a great grieving people, whether we be Native Americans forced to leave the lands where our ancestors are buried, like on the Trail of Tears, or Hispano farmers in this area who had their land grants stolen after the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo, or European settlers evicted from their lands like my Irish ancestors whose landlords tumbled their houses and killed their milk cows in front of them and their chickens, even as they were starving from black potatoes. And then they tried to live it out in what are called scalpines, or these temporary turf houses after being evicted. 1 million people died during the potato famine of 1849, Irish people, 3 million left. And so my ancestors bordered boarded what is known as the coffin ships and came to the Americas. We all share a history of loss. And as we struggled to rebuild our lives in these communities, we helped each other. We engaged in barn building and haystack building. And then the 20th century brought changes that led to zombie ag and the disappearance of our connection to each other and our lands and the stories that we lived in. We moved from a world of manure, right, compost, plowing our fields with horses, saving seeds, to a world of Haber Bosch, which is the chemical process where we can create inorganic fertilizers. So we no longer have compost piles. We have these big smokestack looking things to develop fertilizer from natural gas. We buy seeds, we no longer save seeds, and of course we plow our lands, work our lands with tractors. It saved farmers a lot of work, but it cost them a lot of money. The second major event, and this was talked about yesterday, was the Great Depression and the greatest environmental catastrophe of modern life that we seem to have somehow forgotten, the Dust Bowl, where farm income dropped from $13.2 billion to a little over $6 billion, and the soil just picked up and blew away, suffocating streams and livestock such that people fled from the monster of their lands and moved to the cities. The third major change is the narrative of farming that shifted from community, from feed the community, let's feed the community as represented by the Grange movement, which was talked about also yesterday, to a narrative of that we are responsible for feeding the world. This narrative of feeding the world came from the population in the United States reeling of the starvation that was occurring in Europe after World War II, where 800 million Europeans were starving because of the devastation that had been wrought. And so my mom, when she was growing up, and maybe some of you, this was true for you, was told, eat your peas, the people of Europe are starving. And then global markets and the Green Revolution led to more and more farmers industrializing, borrowing, mechanizing, and under this idea that American farmers are responsible for feeding the world. It came from a good place, but it disconnected to us. So, and this is another major historical event that seems to have been forgotten, that was really the death knell for traditional family farms in the United States, and we're still trying to cover. The growth of global markets led to heavy borrowing because farmers thought that they were going to be able to make money off of selling their crops. And it fell apart under the Carter administration because of various geopolitical things going on. And the farmers fought, they organized, they would disrupt farm foreclosures. There was a movie, Sissy's Basic movie, or no, Sally Field's movie, Down on the Farm. This is where they planted crosses for every farm lost. And in one of the more amazing things, the farmers picked up the American agricultural movement. They got in their tractors in Oregon and Iowa and Texas and drove in the winter in their tractors all the way to Washington, D.C. It was a tractor march on Washington. But the monster of debt couldn't be stopped, and U.S. farm population U.S. farmers went from about a quarter of our population to today around 2%. I had my own story of debt. When my father lost his job at the college in Durango, and even as he struggled selling firewood and my mom took extra shifts at the hospital, we were borrowing money just to eat. And the land payment loomed. I remember as a child, May, $10,000 to the Farm Credit Union. It had to be paid or we would lose the land. So in January, and it's interesting, we look kind of happy in this picture, but it was a very traumatic time. In January of 1975, we abandoned our cats and moved to Washington, D.C., where my parents got fancy jobs to save the farm. We moved back a few years later, the cats were still there. And my parents still worked like crazy. My dad was logging, selling vigas for fancy houses here in New Mexico. He finally was reinstated at the college, and a decade ago they finally paid off the land. They have this story, they had this ability because they were educated and they desperately wanted to save the farm, and they had that choice. But Zombie Ag has built a wall between those of us who eat food and those of us who grow food. Our stories no longer interconnect. And so we look at how, all kinds of environmental destruction related to zombie ag, but it was also that it has hijacked the food narrative, such that small-scale producers are always interacting with the admin that are selling zombie ag, and the consumers are always interacting with the horror that they see out of zombie ag and trying to make better decisions.
Okay, so then with the farm crisis pretty well disappeared from the popular imagination, what we really have left for us is the admin to kind of construct our narratives around food. And I'll read this comic. It says, 2 lions on their hill, free range, grass-fed, farm-raised, I don't know what to eat anymore. And when I found this comic, I was like, oh yeah, right, I think that we could all relate to this. I think a lot of people feel this way. You go into the grocery store and it's just like a total crisis, like of what you're gonna eat and what you're gonna buy. And so we started to think about this and think about what we call relief narratives that consumers use to guide the choices that they make around food. So relief narratives, we argue, there are these narratives that are out there in the culture that are sort of about good, bad, right, wrong, and help the consumer try to suss out what the best sort of decisions are in terms of their food choices. So 2 of the most coherent relief narratives that we sort of see articulated in the mainstream, one is eat plants, not animals, and the other is humane meat and happy meat. And this is really, both of these narratives are really based on ethical claims. They're not so much based on this idea of living in relationship, but they're far more about ethics. So it just becomes about, is this good or is this bad? And so with this eat plants, not animals narrative, this was the narrative that I held really, really strong to when I met my husband. And I was a pretty strong right-wronger at that moment. And when I met him, I held tight to this sort of belief. And so here I was, very much in love, and I still am. So I was like, well, okay, what are my choices? I guess I could just go on this adventure of being in love and give up everything I believe, or I could say this whole thing is an ethical problem and I gotta get out of here. And neither of them made sense to me. I couldn't figure it out. And so I had to struggle. I had to struggle with my thinking and my emotions, and this meant a lot of tears for me, a lot of hard conversations. And I just put this picture here of this steer, number 14, because I think his story is kind of reflects some of my feelings. And so this steer, we were shipping calves one day, and shipping calves, for a lot of you know, is kind of a bad day because they're probably going off into not the best conditions, probably feedlots. But there was one too many steers in the group, and so we had to go back and pick out ones that wouldn't fit on the truck. And so this little guy, I don't know, something about him really appealed to me, and he was the smallest one, I think, and David was like, why'd you pick the smallest one? But there's something about him that I really liked, and so he came home to the ranch and went into our grass-fed program. And so he was there, living there for a few years, and I kind of got really attached to him because he was just really sweet, and he wanted to interact, and he was really curious, and he just was around our lives a lot, so I got pretty attached. And so one day I came home, and 14 had gone. He had David took him to slaughter, and I was pretty sort of distraught about it, sort of internally, but it was also like this is what it means to sort of live in relationship to our food, to sort of struggle with these hard emotions and allow all things to be true, that we can really love our animals and we can also see them die. And so then, along the way, many years later, I run into Temple Grandin. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Temple Grandin's work. She's been very influential in, I think, promoting this narrative of humane treatment of animals and humane sort of meat processing. And so she's designed a lot of different slaughtering systems that she argues helps the animals sort of arrive to the sort of stun box where they will be stunned in a much more humane, calmer fashion. And so she helped one of the local, this is a local slaughterhouse, a small slaughterhouse in Durango, and she helped them design it. And so we got to go on this tour, and David was with us too. And so she literally took us through the whole tour, like if we were the steer. Like so we went even down, like it's like you go down the alleyway, and then she showed it, get in the stun box, and so along the way, there's all these students, and they're just like peppering her with questions. So they're saying, oh, so do you think they're scared when they get dropped off, or do you think they know they're gonna die, or what if they smell blood, and and she had very, very certain answers. She was very sure that she knew how the animals felt, and the students had a lot of relief. And so then when we get into the slaughterhouse and she talks about the animal in the stun box, and I raise my hand and I say, well, okay, but after they're stunned, and they pull them out of the stun box, like sometimes I see them twitching and I see them moving, and like, how do we really know? Like, are they suffering? Are they in pain? And she said, no. What you're seeing is the central nervous system just sort of shutting down, working its way out of the body, and that's what you're witnessing. And I just remember thinking, oh, phew, like Temple has the answer, and I don't have to worry about this stuff anymore. And so we, as Janine and I kept talking about this more and more, we started to think about all these ways in which all of us are sort of looking for relief from what we know are the harsh realities of agriculture. And we're looking for some way to make sense of making complicated food choices out of relationship to our food, out of relationship to land and animals in our communities. And so that all that we kind of end up with are these stories about sort of right and wrong. Okay, so then boundary labor. This idea of boundary labor, this comes from Coulter Ellis, and we want to use it as a way to talk about what happens to producers in zombie agriculture. And Coulter Ellis argues in his research on cattle ranchers that boundary labor is the work that ranchers do in caring and killing of their animals. And that in industrial agriculture, not only is there a physical distance between the consumer and the producer, but he argues there's also an emotional distance. And so what we have is then the producer then has to then do all this work to sort of manage the emotions of the consumer. And so we were thinking about these third-party certifying programs, and a lot of you maybe are part of them or participate in them. They become quite popular. They cost a good deal of money. They take a lot of record keeping and a lot of bookkeeping, and they're a lot of work for producers. And in some ways, it's sort of like in doing these things, then producers can put these labels on their food and in a sense sort of prove to the consumer that they're treating their animals nicely, almost as if they weren't before. And so this sort of boundary labor too kind of then keeps us sort of all obscured too from talking about kind of the elephant in the middle of the room, which is zombie agriculture. And so just like sort of our reanimation practices, all of this in total, what it does is sort of disappear our story and disappear what's really going on in zombie ag.
So, let me find myself here. Our argument is that if we return to a storied landscape through mutual aid and education, the zombie ag and the admin will start to drift off and become less relevant. And I think Michael Phillips, who just spoke earlier, that was talking about sort of the urgency of the time we're in. And it sounds kind of squishy to say like, oh, let's return to the story of the land. But to me it is essential, like till we start to understand the paradox of what it is to be in relationship, and we understand the paradox of what it's like to be a farmer and a rancher, and what it's like to be a consumer, and begin to share our stories and understand each other and have more compassion for each other, because one of the reasons all of these certifying programs happen is that the consumers don't believe us when we say we're nice to our cows. How can you be nice to your cows when you kill your cows? It's like, well, yeah, right, it's complicated. Michael, and so like, how do we do this? How do we return to a storied landscape? Michael Pollan, a few years ago, in 2008, wrote a letter in the New York Times, open letter to the president-elect. He didn't know whether it was going to be John McCain or Barack Obama, calling for a farmer-in-chief. And of course, Michael Pollan is known for saying, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Nice and sensible. And so he argues that a farmer-in-chief would need to help us re-solarize ag. Let's have ag be dependent on the sun rather than on fossil fuels, regionalize our food systems, and to rebuild our food culture, which is a lot of what was being talked about last night at the Mindful Meet. Like, we need to rebuild our food culture. And there's a lot going on, and it's pretty exciting. I mean, it's a lot, and it's not enough, and so you get excited, and then get depressed, and but I love this idea of crop mobs, and Becky Clausen, who's here in our department, has helped organize crop mobs in Durango, where you have a bunch of students or city people, and they go out and help the farmer harvest all of the onions, you know, instead of the flash mob, you got the crop mobs. Incredible stuff happening in schools right now, from the farm to school and also back school to farm. And then lots of interesting stuff going on, like on the Navajo Reservation, also the Lakota Sioux looking at Dene food sovereignty. But we haven't really done much about this debt question. We keep sort of putting it aside. And there's, some of you might know about these Jubilee debt campaigns. The Bible, the Old Testament, called for a year of Jubilee every 50 years that would wipe out all debts, forgive all debts, and let the land lie fallow for a year. Just like stop and let everything recover. For about 20 years, there's been Jubilee debt campaigns to break the chain of debt between third world countries and, you know, poor countries and rich countries. This idea of like Jubilee, not usury, because of course once you borrow, you just get deeper and deeper in debt because you have to pay interest, which is, you know, and usury was a sin in the Bible. And now there's some programs around sort of student loan debt forgiveness and Jubilees around student loans, and maybe having students be able to work on farms for debt forgiveness. But the issue of farmers, like land is very expensive. How do you get into farming? How do you pay off your debt? How do you get the equipment that you need to be able to do the work? This has not been addressed, and I think we need to get really serious about it so that we can focus on our debts to the land and not our debts to the bank. And I think one of the things that's happened with farming and agriculture, and even here I hear little strains of like who's at fault and who's not at fault and who's right and who's wrong. And I think part of it is that we don't remember our past. We don't remember this place of loss. We don't remember the farmers. I had a friend in La Junta who lost his farm during the 80s. And this is a Vandaloria Jr. quote, an amazing Lakota scholar. A society that cannot remember its past and honor it is in peril of losing its soul. And zombie agriculture has definitely helped us lose our soul. So just in finishing up, I started thinking like, well, what are my debts? Who do I want? Who do I owe? Not in some way that I have to pay them back. And this is one person. This is Chuck Bailey. Chuck Bailey, his father abandoned him, he always tells me, with a pair of reins in his hands, in a Missouri farm, in a dirt farm in Missouri, and he decided he needed to learn to horse. So he learned horse. I don't think Chuck ever finished high school, but he's in the Cowboy Hall of Fame in Cheyenne, Wyoming. He has driven multiple hitches for Wells Fargo, and when he comes over to my horses here, we're haying on our land. There's the HD Mountains in the background there, always shadowing us. He's helping us hay, and Bob, who's on the left, is being a son of a bitch, because that's what he likes to be, and Misty on the right is being a dingbat, like she likes to be, and they're getting all, and then Chuck comes over, and they're like, sorry, Chuck, sorry, and I'm like, well, why did they do that? It's like, you say whoa like you mean it tomorrow, you gotta say whoa like you mean it today. Okay. Yeah, Chuck, very important. And then the other thing that I've worked on is restoring this 2-acre piece of land and gardening on it. And it's interesting, like my husband was here, like, why do you have to pick an old road to restore? It's like the most compacted, awful soil in the whole world. And it's like, because it was an old road, and it has the most compacted and awful soil in the whole world. So I've been farming it for about 17 years. I plowed up with my team. Here they're being good. I'm telling them to whoa. The first year I planted, a garden. The beans came up and just sat there. The corn, no way on the corn. And now, after 17 years, it produces a pretty good, decent garden. It even has weeds. The first year, it had no weeds. And we talk about pig weeds. It isn't all just pigweed anymore. So I figure out I got some rhizomal, whatever, anyway, going on there. And I hope that this will be some of the richest 2 acres in the world once I die in 50 years. And I won't be around to see it, but I figure of the millions of acres of land, it's something I can do to restore these 2 acres.
Okay. So I think, this has been a theme that's been coming up in the last couple of days, which I really like. But that eating is a sacred act, and it's an act that keeps us all going, and it's an act that keeps us connected to each other, and to the land, and to animals. And in food production, there's this constant conversation of life and death. And sometimes this is really hard. And so we're thinking about this idea of the radical center as this place sort of where you stand in this tension of opposites between sort of bearing witness to the harsh realities of things or the hard parts of agriculture and also finding beauty in it. And I chose these pictures because this cow on the right who's down, I'm getting emotional. She was stuck in a bog and we pulled her out. Excuse me, I'll take a breath. And so I ran back to the ranch and she was hypothermic, because she'd been in this water a long time. She couldn't get up. I ran back to the ranch and got all my horse blankets, which I hadn't used in years, and I picked them all up and we covered her all up and we gave her water and food and hoped that she'd make it, and she didn't make it. She ultimately had to be put down, but part of this experience of living in relation to our food, I think, means bearing witness to some of this hard stuff and bearing witness to some of the struggle that we so often have to hide. But then also there's that tremendous beauty, I think, that everybody's been talking about here, about being in relationship to animals and land and water and birds. And so standing in that radical center is really this place where we can kind of hold these things together. And so just for me personally, sort of the radical center for me has been about kind of standing in this place where I'm struggling and asking lots of questions and allowing all my complicated emotions to exist, and being in relationship to animals I really care for and that I also eat. But I just want to say, when you're in the radical center with other people, you're not the only one who changes. And so I picked this picture of my husband here and our 2 dogs, and I just want to say, see that little white dog on his lap? So when I met my husband, dogs only were outside, period. They did not come into the house. And now this little white dog, I don't know, he's wormed his way somehow in, and he's pretty much on David's lap as much as he can. He even sleeps in our bed. Oh yeah. And so he gets lots of baths though. So it's not, when we're standing in this place together, this is where we all change. And I think what we just wanted to close with is that this is what the radical center is about. It's about coming together, standing in these awkward places where we might not agree, and sharing our ideas, letting go of our right-wrong thinking, and really trying to find another way to go about things so that we can really live and experience and see the beauty that's always just right in front of us. So, thank you.